I was invisible. For 20 years, I walked the same halls, sat in the same meetings, submitted reports that no one read, and still he acted like I wasn't even there. My boss? The man who could have at least said my name, who could have looked me in the eye, but instead he brushed past me like I was part of the furniture. 20 years. Do you know what that does to a man? Every morning I'd walk into that building with my tie straight, shoes polished, notes in hand. And every morning he'd glide past me, his cologne sharp in the air, his voice booming for everyone else, but never for me. Not a nod, not a word, just silence like I didn't exist. At first I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was busy, maybe distracted. But then weeks became months, months became years, and the silence grew teeth. At company lunches, I'd sit at the end of the table while he laughed with the others. My jokes? They landed flat because no one wanted to laugh with the man the boss ignored. If he ignored me, then maybe they should too. That's how it works in offices. You get branded by someone else's power. And I was branded nothing. The worst was the meetings. I'd prepare, spend nights going over figures, finding solutions, tightening presentations until they were bulletproof. Then, in the meeting room, I'd speak, and it was like talking into fog. He wouldn't even look up. Sometimes he'd cut me off mid-sentence and redirect to someone else, like my words were background noise. And once I gave an idea. Clear, practical, profitable. He ignored me completely. 2 weeks later, he presented that same idea to the board, word for word, and they applauded. I sat there with my hands folded, nails digging into my palms, watching him soak in the praise for my work. He didn't even flinch. You'd think I'd quit. Anyone else would have. But I didn't. Because under that humiliation, under that anger, there was something else burning. Patience. I told myself, stay silent. Work harder. Build your own path. Every insult, every cold shoulder, every stolen word, I stored it deep inside. And I promised myself, one day it would matter. The years rolled on. Colleagues came and went. Some climbed, some fell. Some couldn't take the politics and left. But me? I stayed. Every ignored greeting was a brick. Every insult was mortar. And slowly I was building something. A wall, a fortress. But I won't lie. It hurt. God, it hurt. Sitting in my car after work, staring at the wheel, asking myself, why am I still here? Why do I let him do this to me? And the answer was always the same. Because leaving would mean he won. Because disappearing would mean he was right, that I was no one. And I couldn't give him that satisfaction, so I stayed. 20 years in the shadow of a man who pretended I didn't exist. 20 years of being the ghost in the office. Until the day came when I closed a deal worth $10 million. And suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. Do you know what it feels like to speak and have the air swallow your words whole? That was my life for 2 decades. If I raised a point in a meeting, eyes slid past me like I hadn't said a thing. Once, I remember presenting a strategy I'd worked on for weeks. Numbers checked out, risks accounted for, clear upside. My boss didn't even let me finish. He waved his hand, cut me off, and turned to someone else. Any other ideas? The room followed his lead. My words dropped dead on the table. And then 2 weeks later, I watched him walk into the boardroom with my plan printed neatly in his folder. He spoke every line like it was his own revelation. He leaned on the same graphs, the same phrasing, and the board nodded, impressed, telling him what a visionary he was. No one looked at me. I sat there, heat crawling up my neck, my nails cutting into my palm. That was the day I realized something. It wasn't just that he ignored me. He fed off me. Lunchtimes were worse. I sat alone, not because I wanted to, but because I'd learned that anyone who sat with me ended up invisible too. Colleagues who once chatted with me started drifting towards safer company. After all, if the boss didn't acknowledge you, why risk your own standing? So they avoided me, not cruelly, not even consciously, just enough to make me feel like a ghost floating around the cafeteria. And he knew it. That was the worst part. He knew exactly what he was doing. Power in an office doesn't come from shouting or slamming fists. It comes from subtle things, from deciding who counts, from deciding who gets remembered. And for 20 years, I was the man erased in plain sight. There were humiliations too sharp to forget. Once, during a holiday party, he walked past me with a glass of champagne. I raised my own in a small gesture, a quiet attempt at a cheers. He didn't even glance at me. Instead, he tapped glasses with someone standing directly behind me, close enough that I smelled the fizz spill on my sleeve. He didn't miss me. He skipped me, deliberately. But here's the thing. While he was erasing me, I was watching. Always watching. Every slight, every dismissal, every stolen idea, I recorded it. Not on paper. In me. I turned silence into fuel. I worked late. I learned. I built relationships outside the narrow walls of that office. While he treated me like a ghost, I carved my name into places he couldn't touch, places where real deals were made, and the more he ignored me, the less I needed him. But I never showed it. To him, I was still the shadow, the man in the corner of the room who didn't matter. And that was fine, because I had learned something in the long years of being nobody. The longer they underestimate you, the sweeter the moment they finally have to see you. And that moment was coming. It started quietly. No fanfare, no sudden flash of luck, just the long grind of nights no one else saw. While others were at bars after work, clinking glasses and trading shallow office gossip, I was home at my kitchen table with spreadsheets spread out like a battlefield. Coffee went cold beside me as I read contracts, line by line, trained myself on negotiations, learned every detail about the markets our company was too blind to chase. I built a second life in silence. Out there, beyond my boss's shadow, I found people who actually listened. Smaller firms, hungry startups, investors with sharp instincts. They didn't care that my own company treated me like wallpaper. They cared that I delivered, and I did. Slowly, piece by piece, I stitched together something bigger than the cubicle cage I'd been shoved into. There was one night I'll never forget. It was 2 a.m., my apartment a mess of empty takeout boxes, contracts marked in red pen, my head pounding. I looked at the numbers glowing on the screen and realized I was sitting on a potential deal worth millions. 10 million, bigger than anything my boss had ever touched. Bigger than anything our firm even believed I was capable of. And the terrifying part, it was real. The partners trusted me. The numbers made sense. The timing was perfect. But closing it meant risk. It meant moving without his approval, without the safety net of permission. For 20 years I'd been invisible. But to close this, I had to stay invisible, working beneath the radar until it was too late for him to interfere. So I doubled down. Days blurred into nights, nights into weeks. I took calls in parking lots, whispered negotiations in stairwells, scribbled notes on napkins during team lunches, where no one noticed I wasn't really there. Every handshake, every promise, every late-night email was a brick in a tower I was building far higher than anyone knew. And for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't bitter about being ignored. I was grateful. His blindness was my camouflage. While he wasted his energy preening in front of the board, I was laying the foundation for something he'd never see coming. There was a moment, though, when I almost cracked. One of the partners I was dealing with asked me directly, "Why haven't we seen your boss in these talks?" I froze. My stomach turned to stone. I thought it was over. But then I leaned forward, steady, and said, "Because he's not the one who can deliver this. I am." They didn't blink. They didn't doubt. They just nodded and kept talking. That was the moment I knew the tide had turned. I wasn't just running in circles anymore. I was leading. And when the signatures finally dried, when the ink set on that $10 million deal, I sat back in my chair and let the silence fill the room. For 20 years, silence had been my punishment. But in that moment, it was my victory song. What I didn't know then was how fast everything would change. The phone calls, the congratulations, the sudden invitations from people who never remembered my name before. And then, the one invitation I never thought I'd hear, the Christmas party. The day the deal closed, my office phone, usually silent as a tomb, wouldn't stop ringing. First, it was the legal team congratulating me in their stiff, careful way. Then finance, their voices suddenly warm, like I'd been their friend all along. Then came the higher-ups, the kind of executives who hadn't said my name in decades, suddenly dropping it like we'd shared golf weekends. But the call that mattered most came from the investors themselves. "You delivered," one of them said. "Clean, on time, airtight. 10 million on the table." His tone wasn't surprise. It was respect. And that was new to me. Respect felt like a foreign language, but I understood it instantly. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the same gray walls I'd stared at for 20 years, and for the first time, they didn't look like a prison. They looked like the backdrop of a man who had just pulled off something monumental, while everyone else was asleep. By noon, emails poured in, praise, congratulations, promises to circle back soon. Some of them even from people who'd once walked past me in the cafeteria without so much as a nod. It was like I'd suddenly become visible, my existence validated by a number with 7 zeros. And then came the message. It wasn't from HR or the board or even my colleagues. It was from him, my boss, the man who hadn't said my name in 20 years. "Congratulations, impressive work. Let's talk at the Christmas party." I read it twice, 3 times, waiting for the words to vanish. They didn't. It was real. He'd ignored me through 2 decades of work, 2 decades of silence, 2 decades of erasing me, and now, with 10 million on the books, he was suddenly extending an invitation. Not just any invitation. The Christmas party, his stage, his theater of power. I should have felt triumph. I should have felt vindicated. But what I felt was something colder, sharper. I knew what this was. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't respect. It was theater. He wanted me there so he could claim the spotlight, wrap my victory in his narrative, and parade it as if it were his doing. Still, I said yes. Not because I wanted to celebrate with him, but because I'd been waiting 20 years for this moment. The night of the party, I arrived early. The building glowed with garlands and glass ornaments, the kind of luxury that was meant to impress clients, but used here to dazzle employees. Waiters moved with trays of champagne. The air was thick with cologne, and laughter echoed too loud to be sincere. I walked in, and the room shifted. Heads turned. Whispers started. Colleagues who hadn't looked at me in years smiled suddenly, too wide, too eager. "There he is! The man of the hour!" Their voices overlapped. Their hands reached out, pats on my back like we'd been friends all along. And then I saw him. My boss stood near the center, glass in hand, surrounded by his circle of loyalists. His smile was polished, his posture rehearsed. For a moment, his eyes landed on me, and for the first time in 20 years, he looked directly at me. But it wasn't admiration in his eyes. It wasn't respect. It was calculation. And in that moment, I realized this night wasn't about celebration. It was about power. His power. And I was about to walk into the center of it. The ballroom glittered with gold light, but underneath the shine it reeked of performance. Every detail screamed of control, crystal glasses aligned like soldiers, silver cutlery placed with surgical precision, music just loud enough to drown awkward silences, but not loud enough to break the mask of elegance. I moved through the crowd, and suddenly everyone knew my name. People I hadn't spoken to in a decade clapped me on the back, their smiles too quick, too polished. "Incredible deal. You've put us on the map. Didn't know you had it in you." The last one stung, but I didn't let it show. I just nodded, accepted their handshakes, and filed each false grin away like evidence. Then I saw him again. My boss, the man who had built 20 years of silence around me. He stood at the center of the room, his laugh booming too loud, his hand resting on shoulders as though blessing everyone in his orbit. He thrived on this stage, bathed in it, and now for the first time I was standing on the same floor as him, not as a ghost, but as the man who had delivered what he couldn't. When our eyes met, the room seemed to hush. He lifted his glass, a measured gesture, the kind he'd perfected in boardrooms. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, voice deep and commanding, "I want us to take a moment tonight to celebrate not only the holiday, but also a remarkable achievement within our company." Heads turned toward me. My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. "A deal worth $10 million," he said, his words rolling heavy with pride that wasn't his. "A deal that strengthens us all, that proves what our team can accomplish when we work together." The applause was instant, polite, automatic. But I noticed his phrasing, not "he accomplished," not "his hard work." No, it was "we." He was already wrapping my victory in his cloak, making it part of his performance. I smiled thinly. Let him talk, let him spin his story, because I had been waiting 20 years for this night, not to drink his champagne, not to bask in his spotlight, but to finally take the one thing he couldn't steal, the truth. Later, as the music swelled and glasses clinked, he approached me. For the first time in 2 decades, he said my name, out loud, smoothly, like he'd never forgotten it. "It's good to finally have you here." The room buzzed, but inside me there was silence. Heavy, calm, certain. I met his gaze, steady as stone, and answered, "It's good to finally be seen." For the first time in 20 years, his smile flickered. Just for a second. But it was enough, because I knew what was coming. The music softened. The clinking of glasses faded, and then it came. The moment that would decide everything. One of the executives raised his hand, his voice cutting through the hum of chatter. "We'd like to hear from the man who made this happen. Please, would you say a few words?" The room shifted, every head turning toward me. I felt the weight of 20 years pressing against my ribs. All those silent mornings, those stolen ideas, those humiliations. And then I stepped forward. The microphone was cool in my hand. I didn't look at my boss, not yet. I looked at the room, at the faces that had once seen through me like glass. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady, stronger than I expected. This deal wasn't luck. It wasn't an accident. It was years of patience, of persistence, of refusing to give up when it would have been easier to walk away. There was no sound except the quiet shift of bodies leaning in closer. I've spent 20 years in this company, 20 years being overlooked, ignored, dismissed, and maybe that was a blessing because it forced me to grow in silence. It forced me to become sharper, stronger, more relentless than I ever imagined. I saw my boss stiffen, his smile tightening, but I didn't stop. This deal represents more than $10 million. It represents proof that perseverance matters, that being invisible doesn't mean being incapable, that sometimes the one person you've ignored the longest is the one who will carry you further than you thought possible. Applause erupted, loud, raw, genuine. Not the polite clapping of routine, but something else, something real. And here was the sharp edge. None of it was for him, not this time. The eyes of the board, the executives, even the colleagues who had once avoided me, they weren't on him, they were on me. I closed with one line, deliberate, quiet, meant to cut deeper than a shout. "It's good to finally be seen." The room roared. My boss's face flushed, the applause slamming against him like waves he couldn't command. For the first time, the spotlight he'd guarded so carefully wasn't his. It belonged to me. He lifted his glass as if to reclaim control, but the illusion was gone. People weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking past him, looking at me. And in that moment, I realized this was the justice I had waited for. Not revenge, not shouting, not humiliating him. Just the simple, undeniable truth shining too brightly for him to block. I left the stage to hands reaching out, to voices calling my name. His name was nowhere on their lips. And as I stepped away, I saw him standing alone, his smile cracked, his glass trembling slightly in his hand. 20 years he made me invisible. Tonight, I erased him instead.